Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're tackling education today. And who better to guide us than the one and only John Dewey?
Diving deep into democracy and education, huh? Some really fascinating excerpts you've shared. Seems like you're interested in those big, thought-provoking questions.
Oh, absolutely. How we learn, the whole point of formal schooling, and what it even means to educate someone in a world that's constantly changing. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And Dewey doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. One of the most powerful ideas he puts forward is this idea of education as a bridge between generations.
A bridge. Okay, I like where this is going.
So he talks about this inherent gap between the immature members of society, like us back in the day, and the adults who hold all that accumulated knowledge, those customs, everything they've learned. Education, Dewey argues, is that bridge.
So we don't have to reinvent the wheel with each generation.
Exactly. Without education, we wouldn't benefit from all those discoveries, inventions, advancements of those who came before us. Can you imagine? Every generation starting from scratch. Dewey even says society exists through a process of transmission quite as much as biological inheritance.
Whoa, so it's not just about passing on our genes, but also knowledge, culture, ways of thinking. We're part of this incredible chain of learning.
A vital chain, too, if we're talking about a society's survival and progress. Formally initiating young people into the adult world, their interests, their purposes, their skills, even their mistakes, it's crucial.
It makes you realize how important education really is. It's not just about me and what I learn, it's about the bigger picture, the fabric of society.
Yeah.
But this gets even more complex as societies evolve, right?
Absolutely. Dewey recognizes that in less developed societies, informal learning, like apprenticeships or simply watching elders, might cut it. But as civilization becomes more complex, as our collective knowledge just explodes, you need something more, something structured, systematic.
We can't just hang out in the village square anymore hoping to absorb knowledge.
Exactly. And that's where formal education, schooling in particular, comes in. Dewey argues it provides that necessary framework to break down complex information. We develop systems, symbols, tools like books to make sense of it all.
Imagine learning advanced calculus without textbooks, without a classroom, without someone who already gets it to guide you. It highlights the role those formal structures play. But Dewey doesn't stop there, does he? He also points out a potential pitfall of formal education.
He warns that it can become too, and I'm using his words here, remote and dead abstract and bookish. Detached from the real world, rote memorization, abstract concepts without any real world connection that's not real understanding.
So cramming our heads full of facts from textbooks isn't enough. Tell me more.
He's advocating for learning that's active, engaging, connected to what the learner experiences, what interests them. He cautions against just trying to extract and insert beliefs into students' minds.
I've definitely had those moments in a classroom, learning something that felt totally irrelevant to my life. That's what he's warning against, isn't it?
It's not that formal education is inherently bad. It's about approaching it in a way that makes knowledge come alive, makes it meaningful, and that's where Dewey's emphasis on shaping experiences really comes into play.
So how does that actually work? How do we take that abstract knowledge and make it real, make it applicable?
Well, Dewey would point to the learning environment as being absolutely crucial.
Okay, so when he talks about the environment, is he just talking about like the physical space, the classroom, a workshop, that kind of thing?
It's much bigger than that. He's talking about the sum total, all those conditions that influence our actions, our reactions. Think about the people we interact with, the activities we engage in, the tools, the resources we have access to. Everything that shapes our experiences, that's all part of the learning environment.
So it's not just a backdrop, it's like an active player in how we learn.
Absolutely. Dewey writes, the environment consists of the sum total of conditions which are concerned in the execution of the activity characteristic of a living being. Basically, we don't learn in isolation. We learn by interacting with our surroundings, by responding to them.
Yeah, and it makes you think about how different learning environments can have such different impacts, right? Like being stuck in a traditional classroom versus learning by actually doing something, like in a lab or even out in nature.
And Dewey, he was all about those hands-on experiences. He was a huge proponent of creating learning environments that were rich in experience, where students could really get their hands dirty, engage directly with the world around them.
Yeah, let's talk a lot about habits of thought. What exactly are those, and how do they tie into this active learning approach?
That's a great question. Habits of thought, that's kind of like a thread that connects a lot of Dewey's ideas. For him, they're like the building blocks of critical thinking, problem solving, being able to take what you know and actually use it in real life situations. And how do we develop these habits? Through experience. But it's not just about doing things, it's also about reflecting on those experiences, making connections between what we do and the consequences that follow.
So it's not enough to just go through the motions. We have to take a step back, think about what we've done, why we did it, and what we learned from it, right?
He really believed that reflecting on our experiences is what transforms them into true learning, because in those moments of reflection, that's when we make connections, we draw conclusions, we solidify what we've learned. Think about it. Have you ever worked on a project and then had a debrief afterward?
Absolutely.
That reflection, that's what helps solidify those lessons learned.
It makes you realize how important it is to create that space for reflection, whether it's journaling after a lesson, having discussions, or even just taking a moment to process what's been learned.
Exactly. And Dewey thought this whole reflective process was even more powerful when it happened in a social context, because remember, he saw learning as the social endeavor.
So it's not just about me and what's going on in my head. It's about bouncing ideas off of other people, getting different perspectives, and really refining my understanding through dialogue.
Exactly. And this gets back to his critique of those educational approaches that were too focused on individual learning that kind of isolated students from each other. Because Dewey really believed that the best learning happens when we're engaged in meaningful discussions, collaborative activities.
It's interesting because I feel like we instinctively know this, even from a young age. We learn how to talk, how to behave, how to think by observing and interacting with others, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about a time you've worked on a team. You probably learn way more from that back and forth than if you had just been by yourself, right?
For sure.
That collaborative spirit, Dewey saw that as essential not just for effective learning, but also for preparing young people to be active, engaged citizens in a democratic society.
So it's like he's saying that learning how to think critically and solve problems together, those aren't just skills we need in the classroom, they're skills we need out in the world.
Exactly. He saw this strong connection between education and democracy. For him, a thriving democracy needed citizens who could think critically, work together, and actively participate in shaping their world. And those are skills that are honed through this interactive, reflective approach to learning that we've been talking about.
We've talked a lot about experience reflection, but I'm curious about the role of just plain old thinking in all of this. Where does that fit in with Dewey's view of active learning?
It's a great question, and it gets to the core of what makes Dewey's philosophy of education so powerful. Because for him, thinking isn't something that just happens up here in isolation. It's very much connected to experience to action.
It's not enough to just have thoughts bouncing around in our heads. We have to actually do something with them,
Hmm.
right? See what happens when those thoughts meet reality.
Exactly. Dewey saw thinking as a process of inquiry, like actively trying to make sense of the world around us. And he thought education should be about cultivating that kind of active, questioning mindset.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do you actually teach someone to think that way? Can you really teach someone how to think?
Dewey would say, we don't teach thinking directly, not in the traditional sense. Instead, it's about cultivating it by providing the right environment, the right conditions for it to flourish.
So it's less about force-feeding students information and more about giving them the opportunity to actually use it, apply it, maybe even get it wrong sometimes.
Exactly. He was a big advocate for giving students that space to experiment, test their hypotheses, and, yeah, even make mistakes along the way.
Mistakes were okay.
Oh, absolutely. For Dewey, mistakes weren't failures. They were opportunities, invaluable learning moments.
It's like we have to shift our whole perspective on it, right? Instead of being afraid to get things wrong, we should encourage that spirit of experimentation, where those wrong turns are just part of the process.
It's so true. He saw those mistakes as a signal to pause, to think about what happened, why it happened, and try again. It's that iterative process, the trial and error, the reflection, the adjustment. That's where real learning happens.
It reminds me of the scientific method. Scientists don't just magically arrive at the right answer. It takes a lot of testing, analyzing, revising based on the evidence.
And Dewey believed you could apply that same spirit of inquiry, of experimentation to all areas of learning, not just science. It's about cultivating curiosity, asking thoughtful questions, and being open to new ideas, new perspectives.
Yeah, it sounds like he's encouraging us to be lifelong learners, always looking for new knowledge, challenging our own understanding.
Absolutely. But remember, for Dewey, learning wasn't this solitary pursuit. He also emphasized the social aspect of thinking.
So it's not just about me and what I think. It's how my thinking evolves by interacting with others.
That's exactly it. We learn and grow by bouncing ideas off each other, considering different viewpoints, having those thoughtful debates and discussions.
it makes you realize how important it is to create those learning environments where everyone feels safe sharing their ideas, even if they're different, maybe even if they challenge the status quo.
That's the key, right? For Dewey, a thriving learning environment isn't about everyone always agreeing. It's about having those respectful disagreements, challenging each other's assumptions, and ultimately coming to a more nuanced understanding together.
This has been an amazing dive into John Dewey's ideas on education. It's clear he saw it not just as a means to an end, but as this incredibly powerful force for shaping individuals, for shaping society. And as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with a question. How do you see Dewey's ideas playing out in your own learning journey? What resonates with you? What challenges you? We'd love to hear your thoughts.